All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. Welcome back to Radix Live. We are on Twitter and Odyssey. And today, Mark Brahman is joining me. Mark, how are you?
I'm doing well. The world is kind of going to hell, though, it seems. So I've kind of, you don't let it get you down, I suppose. But it's just, it's pretty remarkable.
Yes. The poor performance of the U.S. team in the luge competition was really depressing.
I
But
was thinking, I was thinking of that.
yeah.
It's amazing how uh, the Olympics have fallen in prestige. It's just like so.
Yeah, it's not something people I used to care about it quite a bit when I was a kid, and now I pay attention to it a little bit, but I don't know what the reason for that is.
Yeah, I don't.
Exactly.
I probably. It probably has to. It's probably related to the dominance of like American, like the sort of corporate sports in America and people being sort of fixated with those,
Yeah.
combined with sort of American obliviousness to the rest of the world, and
Yeah.
um, I don't know, a couple of factors, I think. And I mean, the game. The problem is that the sports themselves or can often be obscure sports that people don't follow or don't even have professional uh, representation in the world,
Yeah.
whether in America or otherwise, right?
Yeah.
So it's like it's the only time that people are really seeing some of these sports. So I think that those are factors as well. But I think there used to be a time like back in like the 80s or something. It used to be like a thing.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, you wouldn't I remember this in high school, you wouldn't you wouldn't follow, say, women's figure skating at all. You would only watch it every 4 years, but then when it was on, you would deeply care about it. I mean, I actually was fairly young, so were you during the, Tanya Harding, Nancy Kerrigan, episode, which is, kind of, darkly hilarious, I guess, depending on your perspective, but, I remember that was everything that everyone was talking about, and, I don't know, it might tell us maybe something a little bit about nationalism, like a notion of great nations around the world competing, in a, nonviolent and harmless manner, and a kind of sports as diplomacy, you could say. I think that has gone by the wayside, and people are instead, you know, avid football fans or
yeah, it's
whatever. I
decline
think
of
it does tell us something.
yeah, yeah, decline of national consciousness, and
Yeah. And
I
your
think
consciousnness is a great power or something, and it's something that's very different. But yeah, it's also, I mean, we can talk a little bit about this before we get started, but it's um also, I mean, I have a lot of ambivalence about the Canadian protest. I mean, it it's probably not a protest that I myself would join. That being said, you know, all of that aside, I mean, there's something out there in the zeitgeist that gives birth to these events like January 6th and the trucker protest. And I think it's actually something that's very different than an event like Charlottesville 4 or 5 years ago that was really a kind of alt-right or far-right phenomenon. I think this is actually a normie phenomenon. And, I don't think there might be a lot of people who are kind of, vaguely or tangentially associated with the alt-right or the dissident right or whatever, white nationalism, that are involved in these things, but I don't think that's the consciousness of the vast majority of people who are there. And, so it is a kind of there's a normie angst, for lack of a better term, and it expresses itself in these ways that are kind of, kind of imperfect and so on. But it's also very clear that the the establishment is fearful of this, or at the very least does not see it as legitimate. And what the kind of tough talk that I've seen, and not just tough talk, but actions from the Canadian government are remarkable, very much like January 6th. And again, I obviously don't support January 6th. It was a buffoonish coup attempt. But the level of seriousness that the establishment takes these things is something that the participants don't quite understand and predict. And they think they feel this angst, and they want, and it's angst about something that maybe they can't articulate, just losing your country, all this change, COVID restrictions. COVID is this like deeply ambiguous disease. They don't understand it, they don't like it, and they go out and they kind of lash out, and the establishment actually takes it extremely seriously and will deal with it in completely draconian ways. And it's just a remarkable thing. And I don't think you can even predict how this angst will kind of materialize in the world, or you know who would, I didn't certainly didn't predict January 6th. Who could have possibly predicted a trucker revolt in Canada, of all places? But I think every 6 months to a year, I think there's going to be something like this. I think it's a long-term thing, and I think the establishment is going to crack down on it harder and harder. And all of these people are going to feel a lot. I mean, they're going to feel a lot like where alt-right people felt, 4 or 5 years ago. And it's actually going to be worse and more intense, because due to the kind of normie conservative nature of these events, they're going to be a lot bigger. They're going to have much more appeal. And that it's an interesting phenomenon. I'm not even sure exactly what to make of it yet.
Yeah, in some ways, it seems like it's the last gasp of the trucker class, because
Yeah.
those jobs will be automated, and that will no longer be a weakness to the elite. This,
Yeah.
they'll no longer be required for this kind of critical infrastructure of distribution, effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they are absolutely the lifeblood of globalism. I mean, these products moving around the country or the world, the continent, does not happen without them. And they were considered essential workers. And then when they lash out, for whatever reason, the reasons are imperfect, to say the least. But when they lash out, the state is going to crack back on them. And yeah, I mean, I can see ramping up automation. I mean, this protest, according to some estimates, has cost $100-200 million a day to the economy, and probably more than that when you think of using the bureaucracy and police force and government against them. And I think that will probably speed along automation of trucking. It might have taken 10 years, now it's going to take 3 or something like that. But we shall see. Okay, so we're going to talk about The Karate Kid, fun movie, and REM laden, we could say. But before that, if you would like to ask a super chat, we'll get to those in a little bit. You can go, we're doing it through Entropy, so you can go to entropystream.live/app/radixlive, and it's on your screen there, and I'll just leave that up on the screen. So Karate Kid, great film. Did you see it in theaters?
I honestly can't remember if I saw it like in theaters or like on videotape or something first. I don't remember.
Yeah.
I think I did see it in the theater. I was really young though, obviously. But I think I did, and I think that there were. I do remember like really liking the film too.
Yeah.
And like there is in this, I think I was too young to like sort of anticipate obvious like sort of plot devices, or or to so one of them was Mr. Miyagi is like teaching him how to wax the car and sand the porch and this sort of thing. And then when it's revealed that he's actually teaching him martial arts techniques. I remember as a kid, I was like, "Oh my god, that's so awesome!" Like totally being surprised by that kind of turn of events. You know what I mean? When it's a very kind of obvious setup watching it now as an adult or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, and then of course the crane scene, at the end is pretty epic. So those are the two things I remember as a kid from the film.
Yeah, it's funny. I must have seen it in theaters because we came in late and I missed the first like 5 to 10 minutes. I remember seeing it later on and being like, "Oh, that's what it is." But first five aren't that important. But yeah, I loved this film um, as a kid. I think it is brilliantly done. Particularly when you compare it to action films now, it's a much simpler story. It's easy, it's straightforward and easy to follow, and like they're just little, you know it kind of, there's like a clear arc to it in terms of time. He arrives in the late summer, and then there's Halloween, and then the tournaments in December, and he has a birthday. It's just a very simple, yeah, it's extremely predictable, but kind of satisfying in that way, and it might not have been predictable when you're watching it when you're 8 or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very memorable film. It's kind of ultimate 80s film, and it has some tropes from the 1980s that I think they've become like cliches, and they're almost now only done ironically, but they're actually pretty fun. The 80s soundtrack, the Cruel Summer song from Bananarama that comes on when they're playing soccer, or the kind of fight montage of you're the best around, and showing all these kind of fight, kind of reminds you of Bloodsport and all this kind of stuff. um yeah, I mean, it like Rocky, like other, it kind of draws upon a lot of those cliches that we now, I think now action movies will kind of reference them ironically, but in some ways they don't have any other place to go. Like they don't, the cliche exists. There's nothing beyond it, so they just kind of ironically reference it with a wink and a nod. Anyway, um, let's let's talk about the film just on a surface level, and then we're going to go deep on this, because in terms of REM theory, Karate Kid is a kind of fascinating example of the caducean. And it I think the real dynamic in this film is different than what you might imagine going in. I think some people probably see that we're talking about this, and they think what we're going to say is that this is a contest between an Aryan and a, let's say, a crypto Jewish figure in Daniel LaRusso. I think that's kind of half right, and I think that's right on the surface level. But as you've helped me see, I think there's a much deeper kind of message to this film, and that message is reinforced with imagery and symbolism. Um, this film, again, much like a Spielberg film, it's coming from the same era. It's very well done. There's some nice little touches, and there are little pieces that are added that you could kind of miss, but actually kind of give a sense of a backstory, or kind of like a bigger world that this film exists in. It's a very well crafted film, and I think it might also be symbolically well. It is symbolically well crafted, even though you have to pay attention to hear those things. But an example of this, there's a scene where Daniel Russo, he goes to pick up Allie with an I, at her country club, the Encino Oaks Country Club, by the way. And that's the famous scene where Johnny is dancing with her, and he runs into the kitchen staff and is covered with spaghetti sauce and so on. And he goes back to Mr. Miyagi his dojo or house, and Mr. Miyagi's drinking, and you kind of learn a little bit more about him. And so he fought on the US side in the Second World War. He fought against the Japanese. He's a very Japanese person. He's been in California for, I don't know, 40 years, and hasn't learned English that well, although kind of understandable. You also learn that his wife and child died in a Japanese internment camp. And that's something that went way over my head when I saw this film when I was 8 years old or something. But I think it's actually very important in terms of the characterization and the suggestion of who Mr. Miyagi is. So would you like to go pick up on that, Mark, or
Yeah, yeah.
or okay.
Well, I think that. So, I mean, I think that what you might be alluding to is that he is kind of metaphorically a Jewish figure in the sense that he has this a kind of Holocaust-like narrative. Am I
Yeah.
getting? Am I sort of understanding you?
That's definitely what I was suggesting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, I think he does. It ends up being metaphorical, and ultimately he does kind of represent a Jewish figure, sort of abstracted as a metaphor.
Yeah.
His name, what is it again?
Miyagi.
Miyagi, right? Miyagi means shrine fortress, right? So it's a reference to a shrine. And I think that definitely what happens in the film is that basically martial arts becomes a kind of metaphor. And this is what I would argue, that martial arts becomes a metaphor for religion, and especially Judaism, right? So Miyagi represents effectively a kind of rabbi, I would argue, and that the dojos effectively represent ultimately kind of competing synagogues or competing sects of Judaism or types of Judaism, right? That's what I would ultimately argue is the metaphor that's going on in the film. And there are many kind of details that reveal that. But one metaphor I would say that reveals it is this idea that that Daniel doesn't really know what he's doing when he's being taught martial arts. When he's being taught martial arts, he seems to be being taught something else, or he's working for free, basically, for Miyagi, and he starts to resent that. But then a kind of Miyagi reveals a kind of gnosis at some point. He reveals, okay, actually, this is what this means. What I've been teaching you is actually a way to fight, right? It's a martial art. I'm actually teaching you a way to fight, and I think that is a kind of very like, I don't know, just a very like great metaphor for Judaism in general, in the sense that it does, I mean, there are a couple of things going on, because clearly we have a kind of bride competition in the film where these two guys are basically vying for this one girl, and they're doing it like through martial arts, like they're basically fighting over this girl. So it's a kind of clear like mating competition thing that's being described. And I would argue that using this metaphor or understanding martial arts is kind of Judaism. It is depicting, which is my thesis, that Judaism is ultimately a kind of bride gathering cult, right? So so that's the fight is for the woman, or it's for the resource, it's for the material. That's what you're fighting for. But I think that Jews, I mean, probably all Jews, I would assume, and this might be a kind of credit or a kind of genius aspect of the religion. Certainly when they're young, I don't think that Jews really understand much about Judaism or what the significance of Judaism is, right? They probably, but as they learn more, through studying the Torah, learning the Hebrew, and they are brought in kind of in stages, they may gain a kind of greater sense of or a greater kind of symbolic understanding of what Judaism is. They may, I mean, a lot of Jews, I think, go their whole lives without really understanding Judaism. I mean, I think
most all Christians go their entire lives without understanding the first thing about their religion.
with Christians, it's
Yeah.
close to 100%. I mean, you
Yeah.
gotta you gotta account for, like,
But they do
there's
it.
some
You know, it's
scripture
like
Jews in
this
there
is
too
the
that probably
way.
know what's going on, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. But,
yeah.
you know, it's like this is the way. Like you do it because you do it. You do it effectively because an authority figure told you to. And maybe you can learn the real meanings behind these things.
Yeah, it's
And yeah, but it's not necessarily that's not necessarily a bad way of going about things, you know.
yeah, so but I yeah, so yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot to, kind of, give credit there for, certainly, but in even the metaphors, I think it's a really cool metaphor. But it reveals that, that Judaism, if you accept my premise that that's the metaphor going on, which I think is kind of evident, um, that Judaism is a mystery religion, right?
Yeah.
And that Jews, even Jews, are don't really know its meaning, or many, if not most, Jews don't know its meaning, and that as you become stronger, or you develop in this art, as it were, this kind of martial art, which is also a great metaphor, right? Because
Mhm.
it's Judaism is a way of Jews kind of fighting for themselves in the world, whether from persecution or for power, frankly, right? So, so I think it's just a great metaphor that works on a lot of levels. I mean, and there are, when you rewatch these things, you start seeing all these other kind of clues that end up just basically confirming or corroborating the.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I noticed, and you definitely see this in the first 5 minutes of the film, which I of course famously missed when I first saw it in theaters. But um, he is an Daniel Larusso is an outsider to this golden state. And his mother actually says at one point, you know, there are blondes everywhere. All I see is blondes. So she says something like that when they're eating lunch. And there's also kind of a sense of a kind of like hidden identity and connection with people in this world. And so there's an old woman. There are a lot of story threads that kind of start out in the first 10 minutes and then are dropped. He like meets a friend in the first 10 minutes, you barely see him again. And he meets this old woman, and she too is from Newark. And she's kind of like, well, you better go back there. You'd be happier, you know, among your own kind. There's actually another moment where Daniel LaRusso, he's visiting Mr. Miyagi's home, and it's a kind of, you know, almost like junkyard with all these, you know, it's more urban in this suburban California environment. And you know, it's got a junkyard, and then he learns about the garden and so on out there. But um he says this reminds me of Newark. And so there's this kind of funny connection between Miyagi and LaRusso. And it's also interesting, and I don't even quite know how to make this, but in the first 5 minutes of the film, his mother says, who's a very sympathetic character, I think. But his mother tells Daniel, "Oh, it's like the Garden of Eden." And there's a lot of emphasis on this pool, this, you know, palatial pool that they're going to visit. So these are small, and she says that directly. These are small things. You can easily miss them, and you can easily dismiss them. Just treat them, oh, these are just a side. But you know, someone wrote this script. Someone wrote those words and put time into those words, and
Orthodox
it's
Jew, an Orthodox Jew wrote the script, so it's not like it's
correct.
so someone who's basically like Aronofsky level, right? Darren Aronofsky is another filmmaker that's he's kind of a very obvious Jewish esotericist. Like his films are kind of symbol laden. And another guy is the guy that did Midsummer, Ari
Hmm.
Aster, I think is his name.
Yes.
So this is like, I mean, there are, Jewish esoteric moralization is a kind of salient and I dare I say even common phenomena among films produced by Jews, written, produced, or directed by Jews in Hollywood. But and it comes in more subtle forms. Like Spielberg would be a more subtle example, I think.
Hmm.
But this guy is like a strongly identified Jew, an Orthodox Jew, and so in He's kind of by nature a symbolist, if you will, right? And he's thinking in parables and symbols. This is something that we have to kind of understand about Jews and give them credit for. You know what I mean? They like to think of themselves as people, great storytellers. It's true. I think that they are great storytellers.
Mhm.
You know what I mean, but they're thinking in terms of parables and they're storytellers effectively. You know, and one of their advantages is, of course, this symbol knowledge or this symbol understanding, and it's also a purpose that they have for their stories, which is something that which is something that we can kind of learn from them in a way. Is to have stories that are both symbol coherent, but are also have a purpose. And their purpose is a very kind of profound and important purpose, which is genetic and sexual success in the world, effectively. You know what I mean?
Yes. And that is what LaRusso achieves. I mean, it's kind of remarkable, Allie with an I, because when LaRusso, when Daniel first meets her on the beach at this party he gets invited to, he's smitten with her. She's a really attractive um young girl, blonde, and
Elizabeth
you know,
Shue, yeah, pretty hot.
Elizabeth Shue, yeah. Still, I would say very well preserved, as they say. She's a very beautiful woman, well into her 50s, I guess. And he's smitten with her, but she's really smitten with him. And it's the whole, if you look at the interactions, it's mostly about Daniel trying to get away from her out of fear, um, fear of Johnny, or maybe fear of her, who knows? And she continues to pursue her,
Yeah,
and
there's
her friends kind of don't know why.
yeah, there's a kind of like Abraham or Isaac in Egypt, or in canon, a theme there where he's like, uh, well, I mean, there isn't ultimately, but there is that theme in Genesis where basically Abraham um, will not identify Sarah as his wife, right, for fear of the native people, right?
Yeah.
He ends up giving his wife to to the Pharaoh to marry. Right. This is one of the many kind of subversive aspects of the Hebrew Bible. I would argue, and but it's because of a kind of fear of local men. In that case, it's a fear of local Gentiles. I think it's different in the case of Karate Kid, but so it is interesting though that it's a kind of reoccurring theme is that he's the foreigner, and he's sexual competition or fear of male anger against his effort to be sexually reproductive in another land, whether with the wife that he brought in the case Abraham with Sarah, or just in general. You know what I mean? To
Yeah.
find a wife in that new land. You know what I mean? So I mean, it's a
And
kind of ancient
there's a
thing.
class element.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. I mean, because this is a story of a kid from Newark. We don't learn about his father. I mean, I maybe his father died. Maybe it seems more likely that there was a divorce, and his mother, who again, very sympathetic character. She's kind of struggling to make it and provide for him. And they drive a bad car. When he first meets Allie, I think he doesn't learn her name at the beginning, and someone says she's the Hills. That means rich. So she's from the fancy suburb, and her and he's not. He's from, what is it, Racina? Is that what it's called? Which is presumed to be kind of more rundown, or a little more impoverished. The first person he meets is an Hispanic kid. I mean, there's some hints, more than hints there. Her parents are these kind of intimidating wasp types, which adds a little humor, I think, to the dynamic. So it is about class usurpation. Also, on some level, it is about this underdog figure who, is sympathetic but doesn't have a lot going for him, and kind of entering a waspy, and I do think Allie is a clear Gentile figure, entering a waspy, wealthy world and winning the girl against the odds. And it should be noted, against the wishes of her parents. Her parents her father even assumes that Allie and Johnny are still together. He's like, "What's going on with you two lovebirds?" or something like this at one point. And Allie's like, "Oh, we're not lovebirds. I don't like him anymore." So he usurps class, he usurps race in a way. I mean, even if you don't agree that Daniel LaRusso is a crypto-Jewish figure, it is remarkable that he's, very strongly Italian and he's in this world of blondes. I mean, there is an ethnic or maybe even racial element to it. When they remade The Karate Kid in the early 2000s or late 90s, they made him a Jaden Smith, a young black kid. It just follows in line, and usurping the will of her parents as well. But why don't we go into names a little bit? I mean, so Daniel LaRusso, Daniel the Red, effectively.
Yeah, and it seems like because I didn't pay like very I didn't look at it in a systematic way, but it does seem like that there might be some color coding going on with the clothing that was being worn in the film. And this
Yeah,
is something that
a
his
lot of
character.
red clothing, his red
Yeah, yeah,
jacket, and he gets
yeah. I mean,
stained with spaghetti sauce, and yeah.
yeah, yeah, a lot of red. And but you also see that Johnny, his competitor, is also wearing red. He has a red jacket. Um,
Mhm.
but so that color is very significant. And I have a theory as to the significance or meaning of that color. But and then you also see she's also wearing these kind of what I would call celestial or aqueous colors. She's wearing white and blue a lot.
Mhm.
Um, and again, I didn't look at the film in a systematic way. And it also seems like he's wearing green sometimes, and green and red.
Yeah,
And
she
those.
wears green, and her when they're doing gym, she's wearing it's like the school colors or something. She's wearing
Okay.
green.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's also gold. There's a bronze plaque that he sees that says something like truth, justice, and tolerance or something like that. He was like, we came to the golden I can go look it up. He When he enters his public school, he sees a plaque like this that says something to the effect of justice and tolerance. And we came here to the Golden Hills. So there's California's the Golden State, kind of gold color.
Yeah, I mean, I think that often too, and I think that I think a really good example of this is Rosemary's Baby, where it does seem like that there is a lot of kind of, and you and I have discussed this film. There is a lot of color coding going on in that film, where basically ethnicity is, I argue, ethnicity on one level is being expressed through clothing, but also there are other things that also get expressed too, and red is one of these colors that I argue might be a reference ultimately to intermixture. You and
Right.
I had this discussion before, and it might be the difference between, if we understand blue is like uh, the color of blood under the skin, red becomes the color of blood exposed, and
Mm.
we're talking about now blood in the ancestral sense of that word, right? Genetic. So it could refer to kind of genetic access, as it were, or willingness to intermix genetically. It doesn't, like, the color red doesn't have an association specifically with Jews or Aryans. It appears to be a kind of, again, a reference to uh, the genetic vulnerability of Aryans, um, and maybe the intrusion or incursion of Jews, you might say, into the genetic line, right? So I think that like one represents the knife that is bloody, the other represents the wound, if that metaphor makes sense to you.
Mhm.
But Adam, for example, Adam in the Hebrew Bible, who identifies effectively an Aryan character, his name means red. Um, so so that shows you. But Adam, again, Adam is a kind of he's a mutable fallen character who's ultimately a golem who's shaped by Yahweh. You
Yeah.
know, so
I
there.
mean, literally created out of dust and given a breath of life. He is the first golem.
Yes, yeah. So the color is interesting, and again, I didn't track it in a very close way in this film, but there seems to be a general color palette, and ultimately these general palettes can, especially in something as complex as a film, the color complex has to be general. in the sense that, like, maybe there will be a red mug or something in a scene or whatever, because you just can't, like, I mean, it has to somehow resemble the real world. It can't be too
Right.
obvious, right? So there are general color palettes and but one a use of red. I mean, just and this is kind of this is sort of it's a kind of I would say I would say it's a solid part of the analysis of this film, in the sense that I think there definitely is something going on with color in the film, but it's probably the most speculative. I think that we have even stronger evidence in, like, the names and other details.
Well,
Um,
the fact that it's corroborated with his last name I mean,
yeah, yeah,
I of course agree that you have to look at anything in context. Like Darth Vader's red lightsaber might mean something peculiar in the context of that film. I think it does, in fact. Um, and what Rem, the bold suggestion that Rem is making is that there's something beyond context. There is a kind of international symbol language that goes back a very long ways. And that's a bold claim, of course. And so, but if it can be corroborated, then it is much more credible. And so I'm sure there are, instances in poetry or, plays and movies and so on where like a color has a meaning in that particular context, and it only means it in that context, of course. But I think it's the very least that we can say is that Kamen, who wrote this, Orthodox Jew Robert Kamen, um, is suggesting something more. He's Daniel LaRusso, tribe of Dan, Daniel the Red, in a Garden of Eden.
yeah, no, no. I mean, of course, I agree with everything you're saying. But I guess, the other salient use of red is and this, I think, this as a symbol is a kind of very interesting and important symbol in the film. And I think that one of the difficulties with my work and with people who are learning about it is that it is ultimately a kind of challenge of, like, gaining knowledge of the different symbols and myths that I'm talking about, right?
Mhm.
But what I will say is that I'm only talking about sort of central motifs and central symbols. You'll verify this as well, that I try to talk about, like, Saturn and Zeus and Jupiter, and what I mean, and central symbols, because ultimately those are the most important symbols. Like, what is the significance of bread at the Eucharist or wine at the Eucharist? Those are the things I focus on, because those are the things that people are more familiar with, but they're also the most important symbols and the most kind of important expressions or uses of those symbols, right?
Yeah.
Um, but so what I'll be describing with this one scene, some of the symbols will be obscure to the audience, because, I mean, frankly, they were obscure to me before I.
Oh, you popped out there. I think you'll I this happened when we were talking the other night. I think you'll pop back in.
But they are actually kind of central and important thing. So I think that there's two things going on in this scene, and the scene that I'm referring to is there's a Halloween party in the film, and Daniel shows up dressed as a shower, right? So he's in this red shower
Right.
with red curtain around him, and there's a very obvious reason why he's doing it. He's trying to keep a low profile. He's concealing himself because he's being bullied by these other characters in the film. Johnny Lawrence and his group, the Cobra Kai dojo, are bullying him. So that's the reason he's doing it, but that's also important too, and that also kind of relates to a possible reference to, and there could be two sort of references going on, and that's possible, is that a symbol, or a there can be many references happening simultaneously, right? There can be
Mhm.
layers, is one thing that I argue, but so um so there is a theme of concealment there, obviously, and that is a theme in Gem generally. It's this idea of the Jews kind of concealing their identity, right? And that becomes part of the way, if we understand Judaism as a bride gathering cult, for instance, there are also, if you're dealing with hostile members from an out group that don't want you, basically stealing their women, then you have to find ways of indirection. You have to find forms of indirection. So that's a kind of the most like sort of easiest and obvious reading of a symbol like that. It could be, but that also relates to the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting is a central symbol in the Hebrew Bible. And I argue that ultimately the tent of meeting is a reference to Genesis 18, which is in Genesis 18, I argue, we see a kind of esoterically conveyed, we see a tryst, a sexual tryst between Yahweh and Sarah, where Yahweh becomes the father of Isaac. So he basically cuckolds Abraham and becomes the father of Isaac. And there's a tent in that scene. And I argue that tent, through various clues, and I show this in the book that I'm going to release with Richard, is also the tent of meeting. Through the Hebrew language, it's conveyed through various clues, is also the tent of meeting that the Jews carry around during Exodus in their camp. And in that tent, they sacrifice animals in that tent, right? And I argue that those animals that are being sacrificed are basically, Gentile stock, or like, so the metaphor is not actually one of animal sacrifice, or dare I say human sacrifice, not that. It's a metaphor of intermixing. Yahweh is a fire god, a consuming god, and that metaphor of fire is related to passion, right? That's an ancient metaphor. This idea that fiery, we have the metaphor still in English. If a woman is hot, or if you're passionate, you fiery Latins, or whatever like that still relates to love. But so that might be one thing that's going on. That might be a reference to the tent of meeting in a tent, right? Sarah meeting Yahweh in a tent. Another thing that's going on is that it's a shower. So it could be a kind of reference to baptism as well. And baptism, I argue, is another metaphor where we're talking about intermixture, right? We're talking about sexual intermixture. And I think that this is kind of understood in a sort of immature, primitive way, to the extent that Christians look at baptism symbolically. They understand it as a rebirth, right?
Yeah.
The water is vaginal and also related to the womb, and is related to reproduction. So that's another thing that could be kind of indicated in that scene. But then it seems like it's kind of revealed in a very odd way, because when he opens the tent, he's hit with an egg in the forehead. I don't know if you remember this, right?
Yeah.
So the egg becomes yet another fertility symbol. You know what I mean? Now this is, I think that people hearing this will be like, oh, you're making all these crazy connections. I'm not. And I just, trust me. And again, an Orthodox Jew made this film, so he's a kind of symbolist. These little details are important. Why is he getting hit with an egg when he opens the tent of the, it's just like, why the writer think of that? As you know what I mean? So,
have you ever been to a Halloween party where someone dresses up as a chicken and throws eggs at everyone there? Like, this is a very specific choice.
Or dresses up as a shower, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's look, again, he's concealing himself, but and I think, and there is like a more obvious kind of sexual innuendo there as well, in the sense that they're meeting in a shower. So that has sexual overtones, obviously, right?
Yeah.
But I think that there are also deeper things going on. And then the egg becomes related, symbolically, the egg is her egg that's being smashed against his head, right? So that's one thing I would point to. I think we're talking about colors. The other use of colors, well, he paints the fence, and this is the scene where LaRusso is being taught by his sensei Miyagi. He's being sort of esoterically taught his martial arts by doing things that seem unrelated to fighting, right? Again, it's a perfect metaphor for Judaism, right? Judaism has this sort of benign, even benevolent appearing exterior. You remember that rabbi was talking to you, he was like, oh, Richard, we should go over the Torah together. Like, and I can show you that it's a book of peace. It's a book about peace, right? And I mean, I think the jury is still out. Is that guy full of shit, or was he, or was he like a
W-
suspect, naive Jew? Who knows, right? I mean, he seemed like a nice guy, but you
yeah.
understand what I'm saying, that there is this benign, innocuous exterior, but what he's learning is he's learning martial arts. So I think he's learning to fight and fight for women, right? That's ultimately what he's
Yes.
learning.
Just a
But
quick ad here. I don't know how anyone could possibly read the Old Testament and see it as a book of peace. It is the most grandly and grotesquely violent document.
is
I
that
mean,
what I can't remember exactly what he said, but wasn't he
he
saying
said
something like
something
this?
of that. Not
Yeah,
that there aren't maybe some, I mean, just to be overly fair, not that there aren't some lessons that everyone can learn from or whatever, but yeah, I mean, it's a book of war, genocide, subversion, and piling up mountains of foreskins. I mean, it's just ugh. Anyway, I don't know how you could
yeah,
possibly read
and
the Old
honestly,
Testament.
I would say that, like, I would cut them
What a
some
nice document.
yeah, yeah. I would cut them some slack and say that some of that, violence is metaphorical too, so it's not,
Sure.
you know what I mean? But, like, even the burning of animals in the tent may be metaphorical. I argue that it definitely is. But,
Yeah.
so, um yeah, so I forgot what so the other use of color is, the painting. He paints the wood fence brown, which I
Hmm.
think is significant. And this may seem remarkable to people who are not kind of familiar with my work, but there is a theme wherein it will make sense intuitively to people. For example, to the extent that people on the right understand Jews as people who are interested in a more diverse country, right, a darker country, right, and through their political activism and through their propaganda, they promote these things. Well, I argue that in maybe some people are familiar. I mean, there's one salient example that I think a lot of people are familiar with, that this is also something that's contained in the Torah and in the Hebrew Bible, this kind of prerogative or this agenda to darken the flocks of Laban, as it were, right? And that's exactly how I interpret and how I think it should be interpreted, the darkening of Laban's flocks by Jacob, right?
Yes.
Um, so, I mean, I guess people can look that up. Not to just, I guess we have some ground to cover. I can go into that if you want, but or you can go into it, or should I?
Yeah. Well, I mean, real briefly, I mean, he basically, Jacob is asking for Laban's daughter's hand in marriage. And what is Laban says that you can have all of the bespeckled sheep in the flock or something like this.
Yeah, well, that's the deal Jacob makes with Laban, if memory serves. So Jacob says, "I'll, let me take the speckled or dark sheep, and because they have less value, and also
Yeah.
they're less common, presumably, right?" But then Jacob finds a way of breeding the flock so that it grows increasingly dark, right, and thereby takes more sheep, from Laban, right? And Laban's name actually means white,
Hmm.
and it's clearly a reference to human beings as well, because I mean, even Rachel's name means baby sheep. Rachel's name means baby sheep, and the or ewe, and
Hmm.
um, that the same word for Rachel is used in that narrative to describe sheep that that Jacob is taking from Laban, whose name means white, right? So it shows him darkening the flock. Um, but and this is just a little detail, obviously, in Karate Kid, but he paints the fence brown, right? And
Yeah.
but then he paints the house green and red. And again, those colors are significant. We've already gone over red. In green seems to be related to verdancy, spring,
Yeah.
also the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the vine, but it is related to a kind of potency or virility or verdancy, and in this case, a Jewish verdancy, right?
Yeah.
But so in Gem, we might relate it especially to the vine, as in the vine of Judah, the vine of Bacchus, or the serpent, which is also a symbol of Bacchus. And so,
And for what it's worth, the tournament takes place on December 19th. So it's based this is not a Christmas movie by any stretch, but it is taking place on the time of the winter solstice, which is one of the origins of the Christmas holiday.
yeah, no, that's yeah.
And it is the solstice holidays are levels of the sun effectively. So it gets, the days get much shorter. The sun has its shortest time in the sky and its lowest in the sky. This, once you pass over December 21st or 22nd is when the days start to get longer again. And so this tournament where Daniel will defeat Johnny Lawrence and usurp Ali's parents and so on takes place at the exact moment when the sun is setting effectively.
Yeah, and also I like the story of Christ's birth, I would argue, similar to Isaac's birth, is ultimately, exactly how you parse it may be less clear, but it's ultimately a story of intermixture and of like ethnic cuckoldry. That's if you understand. So maybe we understand Mary as a Galilean, and the Galileans were understood as Gentiles. I mean, symbolically, the Galileans are Gentiles, effectively. And maybe Yahweh is the father, that Yahweh is the impregnating father, for example, right? And Joseph is ostensibly of the house of David, but there was conversions going on during that period as well, so that might play into it. But there's another possibility too, that the father is a theos, and Gabriel is when when the pregnancy is predicted to Mary. I think it's the Annunciation is what it's called. So there's other possibilities, but it seems that it does indicate a tale of admixture, as it were, right? Because at the very least, even if you just understand it kind of theologically or mythologically, we have a god mixing with a mortal, right? At the very least, we can understand it in that way, right?
Yes.
So that may also, so those dates might also be significant for that reason, you could argue. The other thing too, I would say, is the names. I mean, I guess it's probably worth going into the names as well to start to build that part of the case. Daniel is, on one hand, we have this Cobra Kai dojo. Again, we argue that there's a kind of Caducean thing going on here, where Johnny Lawrence also represents.
Let's save that. We'll blow their minds in 5 minutes.
Yeah, but but Daniel, Daniel, the name Daniel is most famous from the book of Daniel, right?
Yeah.
And I think it means something like God's judge. Dan means judge. But Daniel comes from Dan, and Dan is an earlier figure in Genesis. Daniel, I think, means I can look it up and interrupt if it's really meaningful, but I think it means God's judge or something like that. The element El, right? El and Daniel. So, but the element Dan comes from Genesis, and in Genesis he's described by Jacob. There's this section in Genesis 49 where Jacob blesses all his children. This is where Judah becomes the lion, or the lion whelp, the son of the lion, or the lion whelp. Dan is also, it says, Dan shall provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. And Dan shall provide justice. And the word for justice there is din, which is the same word. It's just a kind of different pronunciation of Dan. So Dan shall provide Dan for his people as one of the tribe of Israel, right? So Dan means judge. He'll provide judgment. It's the kind of clearer interpretation of that. He will be a snake by the road, a viper in the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider tumbles backward. Right. So the serpent also is associated with Dan. or Daniel. And I make the argument that Daniel ultimately, I believe he's the first son of Bala, who is one of these servants that Jacob takes as a wife, and he's the fourth son. I think he's the fourth son. I believe he's the fourth son. Yeah, he's the fourth son of Jacob, and Judah is also the fourth son of Leah, so that may be significant. They're both fourth sons. One the fourth son of Leah, one the fourth son of Jacob. May or may not be significant. Birth order is significant in general, though, in the Hebrew Bible is part of the symbolism, right? So firstborn, secondborn, these are meaningful symbols, definitely. Esau was firstborn, Jacob secondborn. So they are thinking in terms of birth order. But I make the argument that Dan represents effectively a kind of crypto Jew, right? So Dan is distinct from the tribe of Judah, but he represents a kind of crypto element of Judaism, right? That's what I argue. And so I think that Daniel LaRussa, he also is kind of identified effectively as a Jewish character, but he's identified as a serpent. In the serpent too, we can identify with Jews. I think in fact there was I'm forgetting the name, but there was an argument, like I think it was presented in the 1800 or something, that the tribe of Judah was like the tribe of the serpent. And I know all the reasons why they would think that, because I agree ultimately with the argument, but essentially, this famous staff that Aaron has in the Hebrew Bible, the word for the staff is mati, I think. But that in the Hebrew, and that word means it means both staff, but it also means tribe, right? So it's both a reference to the tribe of Yahweh ultimately, because Yahweh is the source of the staff, right? Moses, maybe Moses is that, but both Moses and Yahweh are Jews effectively. But so it's the staff of Yahweh. It's also the tribe of Yahweh. So that symbol of the staff means tribe, but it turns into a serpent. So it's the serpent tribe, as it were, right? And even in that metaphor of a staff that turns into a serpent is a kind of metaphor for Crypsis, I would argue, in the sense that wood in Gem is often identified with Aryans, and we'll get into that in a second. But so I think you take my point that Daniel is identified with a serpent, and that's significant. It's an Orthodox Jew making this film, and that's significant. It's especially significant for a kind of broader reading of the film. LaRussa, again, we discussed the color red and its significance. Ali seems most likely derived from Allison.
Yeah.
And the ultimate meaning of Allison is a noble type, right? It's very much like Sarah, which means princess. So it's a noble type. And this is a theme that reoccurs in Gem, is that, I think that Jews have a kind of understanding of Gentile classes in the sense that there are Sarahs, and then there are also Adams or Cains who might represent kind of lower class whites, right? Or laboring or working class whites. Sarah, she represents a kind of elite white, and that's made obvious through her wealth, for example, right? She's of a wealthy family,
Yeah.
So I think that that name carries significance in that way. Her last name Mills, he might be playing a game with the idea that she's kind of milling in the sense that she's aimless, right? So if you take mill as a verb, it could mean that she's wandering or she's aimless, and it's as like referred to cattle, for example, milling around or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or
mill as milling grain or something as again as a resource. I mean, it's also interesting. The country club where she dances with Johnny Lawrence is Encino Oaks, so she's associated with trees, wood.
Oh yeah, that's definitely significant. And that's in fact in Genesis 18, Abraham is sitting by the oaks of Mamre or something like that. I forget the name, but it's called Mamre is where he is, and it's by the oaks of Mamre. And but you're right. So that symbol oak or wood is significant.
Yeah.
And that also, of course, when he's training, he's often working with wood, right? As part of his training that he does with Mr. Miyagi, he's either sanding wood or he's trimming that little tree, the bonsai tree. He's sanding wood or he's painting wood. So he's working with wood, and I think the bonsai tree is especially a kind of interesting metaphor where he's shaping the wood. Um, and I mean, this goes to the metaphor of Christ as a carpenter, I would argue, even, right?
Yeah.
So there's this idea: if the Gentile is wood, you're learning how to kind of manipulate the wood, right? And or paint it, change its color.
Yeah.
So these are kind of significant symbols in the film. Let me think of another. There was something at the tip of my tongue. Unless you want to jump in there. I mean,
Well, I'll jump in, and because I think there's a pretty obvious reading of this that is probably assumed by a lot of people who are listening to this. And then I think there's a deeper level that you have advanced to the concept of the Caducean. So let me give you the more obvious reading. And I think even I'm not saying this reading is wrong. I'm just saying that there's a deeper level that Mark's work has helped us discover. But it's basically this is a underdog figure, Daniel LaRusso, a crypto Jewish figure who's battling against an Aryan figure. And I do think that again, that's not wrong. I think it's only the first level.
well,
And
wait, 1 second though. Let me give us
okay,
let me give us more credit than that, right?
okay,
I think that the rest of the DR or whatever would say, and it is true in its way, but they would say, okay, well, he represents an outsider. He's a kind of proxy for a Jew.
right.
But it's actually much deeper than that. There are these kind of careful symbols attached to this character that are kind of indicating him actually as a Jew or a crypto Jew or something like this. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So I think that we're actually kind of proving the case that what appears in some cases to be proxy Jews or just a story of the outsider may have a kind of greater or meaningful symbolic significance that's more detailed and that's expressing a symbol language, in a way that's moralizing to Jews and demoralizing to us. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So that's the only thing I would say. I mean, it's not, just so people aren't like, oh, well, we figured this shit out. No, you didn't.
Yeah.
You know what I'm
And
saying?
look, and I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of there's a kind of right wing sensibility to Johnny Lawrence and Cobra Kai. He is he's the prototypical bully character from 80s and 90s movies. In fact, maybe even the origin of that, probably not the origin, but the ultimate icon of that 80s bully. And he can be arrogant, he can be a bit of a prick, he's confident, maybe too confident. And he's blonde and tall and good looking. And it would just seem on the surface that he and Allie would make a good couple. They come from the same background, they are of the same ethnicity, etc. And wearing black kind of makes him a kind of badass figure. His mentor, John Kreese, is very similar to Miyagi in that both are war veterans and both have been damaged by these American wars. So Miyagi was fighting on behalf of the U.S., but even so, his wife and child were put into an internment camp and died, very sadly. And John Kreese, certainly by the 80s, there was a perception, and a completely correct perception, that the Vietnam War, it damaged people in ways that we hadn't recognized. That it was a war that the U.S. lost, for one thing, but it was also just a very nasty war in a jungle territory, in a place that people didn't know and understand. And that these soldiers, I think, whereas the World War II soldier was treated as the ultimate hero, the Vietnam War has always had a perception of the soldier much closer to that of the Great War, of a damaged, tragic figure who went and sacrificed himself in a war that he didn't understand. And again, I agree. I think that probably we dramatically underestimate the degree to which World War II veterans were damaged. And so John Kreese is this guy who kind of like feels almost kind of impotent due to the war. Why didn't you just let us win? Kind of attitude, and is living out his 20s in his late 40s as a dojo master, and he's kind of teaching these kids to just achieve victory at all cost, sweep the leg, no mercy, strike first, all this kind of thing. But it's also important, and I think this is significant for what you're going to say after, is that Johnny, a prototypical 80s bully, but he's actually more complicated than that. He's a kind of part-time drug user, but he wants to get off it. He's kind of saying, I'm not going to be a degenerate. He is cocky and arrogant and a jerk, but he's also kind of a fair person as well. And when John Kreese tells him to sweep the leg and effectively to cheat or to bully Johnny, you can tell that he is morally touched by that. He does not want to do it, and he wants to beat him fair and square. At the end of the match, this movie just ends really quickly with Daniel LaRusso doing the crane kick and winning the match. He gives the trophy to Daniel and he says, "You're all right." So I think Johnny is a kind of redeemed figure, and even in this YouTube, I think it first came on YouTube and then it was bought by Netflix. But in this Cobra Kai series, I've watched some of them. I kind of got bored with it, to be honest, but I have watched some. I watched a lot of the first season. Johnny is a tragic and flawed, but very sympathetic figure. He's the kind of guy in his 40s who never grew up and never really made it in life, but is ultimately kind of moral and redeemable, and also kind of cool and fun. And so he is more than just a like psychopath bully. He's something different. But I think as you've discovered, I think there's another layer to him as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, my reading is that ultimately, and this is something, it's pretty funny because I guess people were talking about, I guess some people like the film on the DR, and people were talking about the film. And I mean, I actually never considered the film from a Jem perspective because I just never really looked at it with that lens before. So it wasn't something I was really looking to kind of decode or look at in any close manner. But a friend was like saying, "Oh, you should look at Karate Kid. People are talking about Karate Kid. And you should give us your analysis of Karate Kid." And I was kind of aware of the general reading, which is that it's like exactly what I described, that Daniel Russo represents a kind of Jewish proxy. If not himself intended to be a Jew, but like a kind of the darker outsider versus the fairer, Gentile established group, and that he's kind of coming into their territory, as it were, and competing for the women. And but when I looked at the film, what I had noticed looking at other works of Jem is that the name John was commonly associated with Jews, or that was the trend that I observed. And John, John, as opposed to Jonathan. Jonathan is a different figure in the Bible entirely, and his name has different significance. I would argue he is a Gentile character. He's a son of Saul, and he ends up being a sexual competitor with David. And David basically takes his seat, becomes the heir of Saul, and takes over that noble lineage of the line of Benjamin, Saul. So it's a different character. Jonathan's a different character. Johnny, which we assume is derived from Jonathan, or not Jonathan, from John. And I think that it might be clear that it is derived from John. I'm pretty sure.
He says John Lawrence actually when he's
okay. Yeah. So John and John. So John is a different name, and and I must have seen that at an earlier point to draw on this conclusion, but he so that's commonly associated, or those are commonly kind of Jewish figures, I argue, and then it's a reference to John the Baptist in the New Testament, right? So John the Baptist is a kind of mentor of Christ, and he's the one that introduces Christ to baptism, right? He's the one who baptizes Christ, right?
Right.
And I identify him as essentially a Jewish figure. He that name, and again, commonly Jewish esotericists are using that name to identify Jews. From what I've observed, so I thought, oh well, isn't that interesting that maybe seems like some variance on the trend, because then I saw that the guy was an Orthodox Jew, and it seemed like it contained other elements of Jem. So I was like, huh. So I looked at the film a little closer, and Lawrence is also a name that reappears. Names like Lori, Lauren, they all have the kind of same root and same meaning. Ultimately, they're a reference to Daphne. I argue they're ultimately a reference to Daphne in Greek myth, who was turned into a laurel tree, right? Now, the significance of Daphne is that Daphne is a kind of famous rejecter of Apollo, who is very evidently the Aryan god. He's like the blonde Aryan god. And so in a way, she becomes a kind of Semitic, or at least kind of adversarial. I mean, there's clues in her lineage that might suggest her as a Semitic or proto-Jewish figure, but at the very least, she's kind of adversarial, and represents basically Aryan sexual failure or frustration, I would argue, right? And so those two clues may indicate him a Jew. The first, if we're just looking at the names, the first name especially, John, right? Now the other clues, of course, is that he's in a dojo. His master is also John Kreese, so there's two Johns.
Yeah.
He's in a dojo, and so I mean, theoretically, it could be the dojo could be some metaphor for Christianity. This is accepting that these are metaphors that exist in the film, which I think there's a very strong case for. But my reading, but then the other kind of clue that's very strong to indicate him as Jewish is this symbol of a serpent. Again, we talked about the symbol of the serpent, right? And it's Cobra Kai. So their dojo is the serpent dojo, right? Which in Jem, that would indicate them basically as Jewish, because Jews identify with the symbol of the serpent, is what I argue. And I presented some of the reasons for that earlier. So basically, both Daniel and Cobra Kai are kind of identified with serpents, right? And there is a kind of another interesting, which I think you could argue is a kind of corroborating clue in this, is that during the tournament itself, there's all these people competing, and they have different symbols on their back, or their dojos have different symbols. And one of the symbols of one of the guys that's competing, and he's kind of eliminated early, is the guy has a symbol of a swastika on his back, right? And I don't know if
notice that.
Yeah. He's got a symbol of which is often interpreted, and probably correctly, as a solar symbol. That's how the Nazis interpreted it, as a solar symbol. But in any case, it's evidently has the association with Aryans, right? And so he's kind of eliminated early in the tournament. But then it becomes a tournament between Cobra Kai and Daniel, who, again, I could say you can associate the serpent with him as well. In Greek myth, and myth generally, more broadly in the ancient world, the serpent is often opposed with the solar, some solar or celestial god who's slaying the serpent. A famous example would be Jupiter overthrowing Typhon, but also Apollo slaying Python, right? So those clues would lead me to the conclusion that what is actually being described is a kind of Caducean struggle between two types of Jews, and I think that they are actually being described as two types of Jews. It reminds me very much of Magneto and Professor X, which is also a kind of Caducean relationship, I argue. But yeah, so I mean, that's basically my interpretation of the film, is that it's sexual competition for an Aryan woman between two Jews. Um, and and one Jew we might understand as a kind of more Zionist, but also on some level a kind of more assimilated Jew, like a less liberal, a more conservative and assimilated Jew. Some symbols, to the extent that we understand color coding happening in a sort of sophisticated way, is that everyone in the dojo has a white dojo on. So in a way, they're kind of like assimilated, or they're concealing themselves in whiteness, right? It's an argument you could make. But he's a kind of white. He's obviously a sort of white presenting Jew. He's a blonde, white presenting Jew. That's
Yeah,
my
and
Johnny
just
Lawrence.
to add to this, so in the first season of the YouTube series, again, I think it's now on Netflix, Cobra Kai. It is hammered home that Johnny Lawrence's father is Jewish. Now, it's also his adopted father. This is a man who marries his mother, so you could even think of Johnny Lawrence as, say, an Aryan who is brought into Judaism. But his father is clearly into. I'm forgetting his name. I think it begins with a W. But his father is Jewish, and part of Johnny's story in the Cobra Kai series is kind of overcoming his father, saying, "I don't want your help or your money. I'm going to do something on my own and be my own man." Um, eh, Regardless, yes, he's Kamen, who was involved in the Netflix or the YouTube series, made it very clear that this is what he was doing. The other aspect of this is that, this the Karate Kid came out in the 80s when kids doing karate was a thing. It was kind of a popular fad, and I think it's a lot less so now. Maybe it will change after the Netflix series. But it also might have had a very different resonance for Kamen. This was the time, the 80s, of the Jewish Defense League, and actually a man named Irv Rubin, who might have been a sort of inspiration for the Cobra Kai type. This was the Jewish Defense League, effectively, and it was the kind of like Nazi version of Jews, you could say, where they were getting in fights with neo Nazis. They were badass. They were training. They would use things like they would use slogans like, we're going to fight against anti-Semitism by any means necessary. Kind of Malcolm X reference. Again, this obviously there's a stereotypical, New York Times reading Jew who is intelligent and sophisticated, but also kind of soft. This is the reverse of that. This is the based Jew, if you will, the hard nationalist. He was inspired by Rabbi Meir Kahane, who eventually went back to Israel and started a party that was banned from the Knesset for racism. So they were almost too Zionist for the Zionist. And there actually was a group that came after, I should say, it came after the film in 1984. I think it came out in 1986, and it was called like Kohane Chai, which kind of means Kohane forever. But it's weird. I don't know if it was almost like unconsciously inspired by Cobra Kai, but it has a very similar resonance. So
Yeah.
go
The
ahead.
other thing too, I would say too, is that like, by the time the film is made, obviously Jews are very well established, especially in California. So married into families in California, for example, and a part of the kind of Gentile milieu in California. So, I mean, I think that's another way to consider. It's not like, it isn't like Daniel is like some Jew going to a land of Gentiles. He's going to California, right? Which is, right next to Hollywood. And they, so it's a kind of, by then California is a kind of Jewish power base, or a bastion of Jewry in some ways, right?
Yes.
So I mean, that's the other kind of context to think of it in. The other thing,
Yeah.
though, I was
Ryan Thompson, I'll just quickly jump in with a super chat. Ryan Thompson for 3. He said this is correct. The resonance it has for Kamen, the writer Karate Kid, is that he was literally a bullied Jew who took martial arts. So this was kind of his story that he wrote, and it had very particular resonances for his experience. When he's writing a film for a mass audience, an American audience, he's going to change it and make it kind of resonate for them in this story. But there is a hidden layer of Judaism behind it. I'd also add that Irv Rubin eventually, so once he got older, he was ultimately arrested for a bomb plot, I believe, against Muslims. This was post 2001, and he committed suicide in prison before he faced trial. So he was seemingly most likely guilty. But
yeah. So, Kai. So the word Kai in the Hebrew, though it might be more chai,
yeah,
but you could pronounce it Kai. I think it's one of those words that you could pronounce Kai or chai, if I'm not mistaken.
mm-hmm.
Though it would be incorrect, I suppose, but it wouldn't be the right vocalization. But those letters could form that vocalization, I think. But in any case, the Kai or chai means to live in the Hebrew, right?
Yeah.
So, and it was a reference to the guy because he had died, right? So it says that he lives. That's what that term means, that he still lives or he's living.
Right.
Live. In the Chinese, though, Kai, and I think Cobra Kai would be Chinese, of course. It would be to, or at least ostensibly in the film, it'd be Chinese. It means to open, to drive. I think it might be part of the word karate, but the because karate in the etymology is given for karate. That could be a mistake. What I just said could be a mistake, but the etymology is given for karate, which is empty hand, or it comes to mean empty hand. It originally meant Chinese hand, and then it means empty hand. And that etymology is actually given in the film. Which could be another sort of veiled reference to Judaism, because the empty hand or the open hand, the Hamza, becomes a symbol in Judaism, and I argue it has vaginal significance. It has it's a reference to the evil eye. It's a kind of counter of the evil eye, which also has vaginal significance. But it's a hand that has an eye in the center of it, and so it could also, theoretically, it could be related to a bride gathering theme, or the understanding of Judaism as a bride gathering, initiative, effectively, right?
Yeah. And I would say, I think we should talk a little bit about the caducean itself, because we've discussed the bride gathering element in the sense of Judaism is fundamentally about winning the girl. It's about Daniel getting Ollie. But, again, to go to this other concept of Rem, of the caducean, it's the two-headed, or the two snakes facing off against each other, or it's I think you could better, more easily describe it as like false opposition. And so and we can see this even in the Canadian trucker protests, which I think we'll mention when we talk about super chats. But is this idea of left versus right, Republicans versus Democrats, where they are, the best opposition you can have is the one you can control. So there's a tendency to sympathize among right-wingers. There's a tendency to sympathize with Cobra Kai as the badass Aryan, bullies who are going up against Daniel LaRusso. Now, keep in mind, they are the losers in this, and flawed, and depicted as flawed, and not really as noble. But there's another deeper level, in the sense that they are a group of the serpent. I mean, the serpent is living through them. Serpent forever. Cobra forever is basically what that dojo is about. So it's kind of like, disliking the liberal humanist and instead, saying, oh, that Ezra Levant is a really cool guy because he's like a badass, Zionist Jew who's against Muslims and so on. He just hates them. Like Irv Rubin, what a badass. But again, this is the kind of mind trap that is created for you. It's sympathizing with someone who you can see yourself in, but is ultimately does not have your interest at heart. And I agree. I resisted this at the first because I kind of fell for the trap in some ways of like, Johnny Lawrence is so awesome. But I am convinced by this because it recurs over and over. It's that, you don't like this Jesus-like figure, Daniel. You should go for the hard, Zionist figure in Cobra Kai.
Yeah, and I would actually, for people that would like refute this reading of the film or tend to doubt the existence of a kind of Caducean, because I think that this is a phenomenon through all of myth, right? So it goes back to Egypt. You can see examples of like Caducean myths, effectively. But what I would say, or it goes back to Sumer or whatever the case might be. And I think actually the symbol of the caduceus, one of the possible meanings of the symbol of the caduceus may be exactly this. But what I would say is the following: is that I think that people who say that, like, oh well, that's not what's going on in that film. It's Jews are not that clever. They're just making it's basically they're just having the Aryan as the bad guy or whatever. Well, they are clever, first of all, and usually they're more clever than the people writing these films tend to be more clever, frankly, than the people in the DR. I mean, that's just the truth. You know what I mean? And the other thing too, I would say is that these people in the DR who understand that false opposition is a thing, that there is control both in the Democratic and Republican Party, and that's kind of the way things work in our society, right? At least at present, right? That there is such a thing as false opposition, and being able to control both sides to make sure that ultimately everything goes in your direction. So that exists. So if that exists and people are conscious of that, because they would have to be conscious of it for it to happen, right? Why wouldn't artists, of a similar mindset or of a similar people or of a similar ilk, not also be aware of the phenomena and want to kind of describe it in art, because they're interested in making their art as kind of interesting and true on some level as possible, right?
Yeah.
So, do a little math there, guys, for those who are, kind of resistant of this thesis. I mean, it's kind of,
and also even the
real
Trump.
world, why wouldn't they put it in their art? I mean,
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And again, like a film like The Karate Kid is watched today. It's a classic. It's had more impact, much more impact than like some figure like Ezra Levant, who's kind of an obvious, a false opposition figure. People are gonna be watching this movie 20 years from now and be like, oh, what a classic. It's gonna have a huge impact. It is a major weapon in this arsenal. They would be crazy not to use art in this struggle in the way that they use, Ezra Levant or Bill Kristol or whatever kind of false opposition. I mean, the ultimate false opposition is Donald Trump. Donald Trump in 2016 was endorsed by David Duke, by myself, most flamboyantly. He is he's not wrong that one of the times when he is not, his boasts actually carry a lot of truth to them, is when he claims he's the most Zionist president in world history. And so you have this figure who became a symbol of white nationalism and the revolt of the masses and white people waking up and so on, who is the ultimately kind of hardest core Zionist we've ever had in the presidency. So this is just a recurring theme over and over and over again. And of course, it's going to also recur in a really well done and deceptively sophisticated movie like the Karate Kid.
Yeah, and if we think that, so if this amount of kind of intelligence or thought or cleverness is being put into something as ostensibly frivolous as a Hollywood summer action film, um, or teen romance, or whatever category you would put it in, I think that, religion. Let's think about religion now, right? Christianity, I would argue, is the ultimate example of this, of the caducean, right? A false opposition. um, you
Yeah.
know so, and I think that that's ultimately, and that has ramifications in politics as well. I mean, it has ramifications in religion and art and in culture, but it also has ramifications in politics. Especially, we see people in the DR who are billing themselves as, trad caths or Catholics, and ultimately, when the rubber hits the road, they are not against the establishment. What I mean? They're kind of like, they're controllable. What I mean?
Yeah.
There's a kind of final weakness there, that they, their highest priority is not race. It's worshiping a Jewish God effectively, you know?
Yeah.
And that's meaningful. It's not just symbolic. It's meaningful, you know? And I think a lot of them wouldn't deny that on some level,
No. Okay. Let's do this. Let's go to some super chats, and some of these relate to the film. Some of them relate to the trucker protests. So again, if you'd like to jump in, it's entropystream.live/app/radix live. You can see that down in the banner, and I will read some of these off in just one second. Ryan Thompson, the Canadian protest was literally astroturfed by a Jewish homosexual who is part of an organization called LGBT Tories. These conservatards never learn. I didn't know about that. It does not surprise me. I mean, there was actually a homosexual figure who was actually even arrested at January 6th. I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but he was part of this kind of like leaving the left campaign. I forgot what they called it, Dem Exit or something like that. And he was a big person in the Trump movement. There are many such cases, as they say of this. I've noticed that a lot of liberals have focused on some of the organizers who are have kind of great replacement or proto white nationalist conceptions of what they're doing. All of these people are those who will say that I'm not racist or anything, but they will at least kind of evoke great replacement ideology. And but of course they're not ultimately doing anything that would reverse that. They're talking about freedom and liberty and getting rid of mask requirements. Now, I get it. COVID restrictions in Canada are more draconian than they are in where I live, and even more draconian than in California or something like that. I get the frustration, but this big white revolt happening in Canada isn't going to change any of these things that are happening. Ezra Levant leads the vanguard of the white revolt. Can I throw up now? Yeah. I mean, this is also by Ryan Thompson for $5. Yeah. I mean, I saw that very early on that this was like 2 weeks ago when they were meeting. It might have been in Ottawa, it might have been in Toronto, and Ezra Levant is right up there on stage. This is from Yehuda Finkelstein for 10. Richard and Mark, isn't it true that normies are the people behind events like January 6th and the Canadian trucker protest? In large part because they can't make sense of declining living standards, while people in our sphere have been aware of the decline for a long time and are resigned to it. Yeah, I mean, I do think that I think January 6th has a lot of layers to it. On one level, it was absolutely an attempt to keep Trump in office. I mean, there were collaboration with the Federalist Society, and there was a plan in place for Mike Pence to reject the electors and then basically get Trump elected because Republicans like controlled more state delegations or something like this. It was like a domino effect that was going to happen. It, in all likelihood, would not have worked. It would have led to a shit show if it had been enacted. And ultimately, Mike Pence was not willing to do this, but it was an attempt at that. I do think that it was also kind of like the normies Charlottesville, so as is the trucker protest, in the sense that all of these, I mean, there was some crossover with the two events, someone like Nick Fuentes or Baked Alaska being prime examples, but it was a different type of person. I mean, with Charlottesville, and I was involved with the planning of Charlottesville 1 in May of 2017. I was not involved with the planning of Charlottesville 2, but in Charlottesville 1, there was an idea of, this is an alt-right event, but we're gonna, go and protest or protest in support of the statues, this is something that is really significant, and it's something that we care about, and we can kind of translate our message to the normies. That was at least how I understood it. January 6th and the trucker protest is very different. I do think that these are normie types in the base organization of it. I think they would faint if someone accused them of racism. And I think most all people taking part of it don't see it that way. They don't see this as, well, this is really about demographics or something like that. It's really about the white race. I do not think they see it like that at all. I do think that they have an underlying angst. I think the kind of a more proximate cause and kind of catalyst, you could say, was just the whole COVID, era, and just wanting it to end and being sick of it and not understanding it and all of that. So it is kind of like the normies revolting in this way, but they're revolting again in a way that's not going to really change anything. I mean, these COVID restrictions will end at some point, and they have, for most of us in the United States, they really have ended. It's more difficult flying around the country, et cetera. The kids with masks, I get it, but these things are being removed slowly, and they're even being removed in Canada. I think some of them were removed last week. So they're protesting in a way that's not going to really affect anything. And are they against mandates? Well, 90% of truckers have already been vaccinated. So what are you protesting against? There's this vague angst that expresses itself in this way. But the truckers have gone balls to the wall in the sense that they have cost the Canadian economy hundreds of millions of dollars a day. They have shaken up or scared the establishment, and they are going to be treated as if they were, card-carrying alt-right neo-Nazis. I mean, they are going. The government has made it explicitly clear that they are going to freeze bank accounts, seize Bitcoin, and cancel insurance. I mean, the establishment has struck back. So they are going to be treated like that, but then they're again engaging in this protest that's not going to really accomplish anything. So it's something that I could only look at tragically. Okay, I'll read another one here. This is Ryan Thompson again for 3. The Resonance. Okay, that was the one. Have you or Mark read The Jesus Hoax? I have read that book. It's by a man named Scribina, who's an interesting professor. I believe he was at Michigan for a while. It's a short book. It's kind of cursory. It almost reads like an essay or kind of a rough draft that needs some more processing to it. But it's a good book. It's a good kind of starting point. It is, again, in the Jesus myth genre of thinking about, one of the unique things about Christianity is that it treats Jesus as not just a God man, but as a historical figure. Like, this really happened. I think probably something in this line happened, but Scribina is taking up Nietzsche's charge and kind of taking it to the next level. This notion that it was actually Paul who invented Christianity, and that it was a advancement on Judaism that was directed against the Roman Empire. Again, there's some problems with the book. It's a bit, it feels like a rough draft or like a web essay to me reading it, but it is still good, and it's a good starting point. But have you read Scribina's book?
No, I haven't read it. I mean, I think it's great that the guy wrote that book. It's,
Yeah.
and so I think that's a great development. So I applaud him for that. I think I read some of the introduction. It seemed intriguing. He also was selling like a Savitri Devi book on his website or something, which I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think he's edited a Savitri Devi book, and he references some other controversial material in the footnotes of that book. So
So
who knows?
Guys, it sounds good. So we'll have to send him REM theory too.
Yeah, definitely. I would like to be in touch with him.
Yeah, but the other thing I would say too is that so his premise, which is an interesting premise, and you felt convinced by the argument he was presenting, or
his argument was very compelling, and
as
it
was a project of Paul, essentially,
right?
Yeah,
and I mean, I've been a Nietzschean for 20 years, so it's not like this came out of left field for me, and it resonated with me. I mean, I would say that Nietzsche did not go full hog, as it were. Nietzsche, there's no indication that Nietzsche believed that Jesus, in fact, didn't exist. I think he takes the whole thing at face value. But Nietzsche was also writing in a time of the, higher criticism in Germany, where they were really looking at the Bible as historians and as critical literary theorists, you could say, as well. Like, they were, this was the origin of the documentarian thesis, and et cetera. So they were looking at this holy text in a scientific manner, and that caused that caused tremendous damage to the credibility of Christianity when this was done by these very serious men. Nietzsche was coming in the wake of that, and so I resisted the notion that the mythic theory of Jesus, but to be honest, I would say at this point I'm all in with it.
I am too, but I don't think it's I think whether or not he existed as a person is not the hill to die on. It's just but I think because there's it depends how credible people find evidence, right? And I don't think that the evidence is strong enough that he did exist. And in my view, he's clearly a mythological figure who's based on other mythological figures. Right. So I think it's probably the case that there wasn't even a guy that they were basing him on, but there may have been, and I think that that's even possible or whatever. I mean, theoretically, there were a lot of people named Jesus at the time in ancient Israel. So but I don't think that the name Jesus would have been chosen arbitrarily, though, because they attach so much significance and importance in choosing names that there's no question in my mind that the name Jesus Christ is a very kind of deliberately chosen name, and that it has important symbolic meaning. So there you go. So I mean, knowing that if the name is highly symbolic and has a parabolic value, then it seems less likely that he was an actual real person. You know what I'm saying?
Well, and also, I mean, like this figure named David Price, who's a Jesus mythicist theorist, and he's a independent scholar, former Christian, and he also just seems kind of like a fun guy, a kind of Falstaff figure of sorts. But he made a very compelling metaphor in this line where it's like, look, we have Josephus. We don't have other contemporaneous people writing about Jesus, but there is some evidence, and there's believability in the sense of like, what were there figures who were, Jewish zealots who were crucified, and maybe even one of them claimed to be king of the Jews. That seems, yeah, there probably was some kind of, maybe a composite of 3 or 4 different figures who were, put together into this myth. But what David Price was saying vis-a-vis mainstream historian like Bart Ehrman, he was basically saying, look, none of you actually believe that he's the Son of God, or that he walked on water, or multiplied loaves of bread, or turned water into wine. So what you're saying is he's not Superman, but Clark Kent existed. So he couldn't fly and stop bullets with his teeth or whatever, but there was some nerdy journalist who worked at the Daily Planet. And what David Price is saying is like, Clark Kent is just as mythological as Superman. You can't just say that he wasn't a miracle worker, but then say, oh, he was a real guy nevertheless. Like, both of those are mythological entities. So you haven't really accomplished anything by kind of bringing Jesus down to earth.
Yeah,
and
no,
I think it was a really compelling and metaphor as well, kind of a very good metaphor in this case as well, with Clark Kent and Superman.
I agree. I mean, again, it's not the hill to die on, but it's like it seems likely that he was just a myth. He also
No, we're not going to die on the hill because
he's also evidently
Yeah.
based on Joshua in the Hebrew Bible, I argue, right? Who had the 12 spies, and who also crossed the Jordan, also has a kind of important connection to the Jordan, right? So the baptism in the Jordan becomes a reference also to the crossing of the Jordan. The 12 spies become a reference to the 12, the 12 tribes of Israel, but also the 12 apostles, right? So these are all kind of clues, effectively, that it's actually there are many clues that would suggest that the name Jesus is based on Joshua in the Old Testament. So, I mean, come on.
Yeah.
And in fact, I would argue that. In fact, I would argue that, and I put this in the book as well, is that Moses. I would argue that the name Moses is, and you can look at this etymologically, is related to Messiah, right? So Moses means Messiah, I would argue. But that's so between Moses and Joshua, you basically have Jesus Christ, right?
Yeah.
Because Christ also means Messiah. And
it's a direct translation in Greek.
Yeah. And the word Messiah also means to be anointed. And that's related to, in the case of Christ, it's related to his baptism in the Jordan River, right? So, I mean, these are myths. They're evidently myths. And it's just, it's just amazing that they were able to pull it off. But I think that there is a kind of advantage that Christianity had versus the Greco-Roman myths, in the sense that it was like Jews must have recognized that some people actually believed the myths to be true, the Greco-Roman myths to be true. And so they went about fabricating effectively a kind of more credible or documentary version of because there is more realism, we have to admit, to the New Testament than there is to the battle of the giants and the Olympians, or the Olympians and the Titans, or whatever, right? There's more realism there. But it's still evidently parables or myths,
Yes.
So.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, I mean, obviously we'll never know the answer to this unless we find some ancient diary or something where someone says, "Oh, I met Jesus Christ the other day and he turned, water into wine." But so in that sense, I think we should keep
I don't know why we would believe that ancient.
That's true. It would kind of compound the problem, I assume. Yeah. But, never, you understand what I'm saying. Like I think we'll never really know. And I would also suggest that, like, the notion that there was a zealot type, maybe named Jesus or not, who is crucified for declaring himself king of the Jews. I bet there were figures like that. at that time. So it's one of those things where it might very well be based on something. But again, what's unique about the Gospels is that it's this attempt to um, make Jesus a kind of historical myth. Like he's a superhero in that sense. He's kind of like mythological, but he's in the real world. That's what kind of superhero films and comic books are. It's this God man like Superman, but then Lois Lane is a normal woman, who's kind of that's the kind of dynamic to it, which makes it very interesting. And I think that's what was going on. And in terms of inventing Christian theology, I mean, I do think that there's a tremendous influence of Plato, which has been underappreciated. But also, Paul did invent this, and Paul did not read the Gospels. We should remember. And he wrote these before the Gospels. So he was inventing a kind of like post Judaism or Judaism 2.0, and creating a theology around that. And then later on, some kind of documentarians would write these stories of how this was kind of brought into the world.
No, it sounds like a fascinating book. I mean, the only thing I would say is that, like, the important takeaway is that Jews invented religion, right, in a kind of conscious and political manner, right? So they were thinking both politically and consciously and in terms of power and really in a very sophisticated way about how they could affect the Gentile population psychologically as a kind of psychological warfare, through religious means. I mean, that's what religion is. It's psyop. It's psychological warfare. You know what I mean? So that is, I think, the most relevant piece. Now, whether Paul, whether some historical figure named Paul was the one who was responsible, that's interesting. But I don't know. I think the germane point is that Christianity is gem.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That's the most important point.
Yes, and I would just say this. Sorry, my dog is barking here. If you hear that, but yeah, I mean, in Plato's Theaetetus, I mean, he is, and the Republic, he is. Hey, come here, Zeus. All right, sorry, my dog wants to join in the conversation. In Theaetetus, I mean, Plato is explicitly defining a religious system opposed to the Greek system, his own gods, in which you will be rewarded in perpetuity for your goodness in this world, and you will be damned to hell for acting badly, even if you win. So even if you get away with it in this world, you will be in effect damned. And so, no, the particular type of Christian system that we know now of heaven and hell and, redemption of sin through Christ's suffering and sacrifice, no, that isn't quite there in Plato, but he's really setting the stage. And, this gets to some things that we developed for the Rem book, kind of as we were editing it, actually, and going on when we were looking into the Copenhagen thesis. But the Pentateuch was first translated in Alexandria in around 250 BC, let's say. It's called the Septuagint. So it's 70 Jewish scholars who ostensibly, translated this work. Well, they translated into Greek for a Greek audience. That is, they were translating the Pentateuch in effect for Gentiles and not necessarily Jews. And the notion that they wouldn't have been steeped in Plato is just simply incredible. I mean, so much of this, I'm not trying to deny a like Judaic component to this, but also so much of this is kind of deeply Greek and deeply Platonic.
Yeah, no, but I would argue that there is a kind of proto-Jewish element there as well.
No question.
Yeah. So when you say Greek, you say I would say it with kind of reservations, but I take your point.
I would say Plato, and Nietzsche also kind of sensed this in his notorious claim that Christianity is Platonism for the masses. And he didn't flesh it out in the way that he needed to, but I think intuited a great deal. So there's a lot of layers. I think what you've focused on, and some other people have talked about this as well, but is that kind of proto-Jewish Dionysian and mystery religion quality to it. And I think that's extremely important. I think there's another layer to it of the Platonism that went into the construction of Christianity, most obviously, but also Judaism. And
No,
I think that
that's true.
it's a
But
complex story.
yeah, Gnosticism too is in there as well, and that was very closely related to Platonism, right? So a lot
Mhm.
of the Platonic Platon Plat-
Platonic, yeah.
Platonic concepts are also in Gnosticism, right?
Yes.
And Gnosticism is a kind of proto Christianity. You know,
Yeah.
it was competing with Christianity for a while, and it has the same roots as Christianity. So I think that all that is true. But I did, one thing I wanted to share, and I unfortunately I don't have the citation, but it's I there was a very kind of profound thing that a rabbi said. I was just watching some random YouTube video, and the rabbi was talking about the Torah, and he said that the Torah is something beyond philosophy, or it's like the end of philosophy, or it's which makes sense to me because it's kind of like, I mean, it is gem ultimately. So it's people taking a theory, a philosophical theory, and making it into a kind of art work and religious work, right?
Yeah.
So they're applying a theory, which I would articulate as gem theory. I mean, that's a modern word that I invented, but it's to describe a phenomena. And they're basically putting that into practice. And so that makes sense to me. So we may observe something similar where there was this kind of like longing or urge to kind of, to assert control basically over a population. And we look at that part of history as as kind of the laboratory where they're like trying to find the right thing that will work, and Christianity emerges as kind of the most potent thing that does end up working effectively. you know
Yeah.
that's one way you could think about it.
Yeah. Let me read one more super chat and then we might call it quits. We've gone 2 hours. That's a good amount of time. This is from Midnight Sun. Hey, Richard, big fan. I missed your Radix show. Yes, sorry, had a lot going on. I enjoy when you're on JFG tonight and on the last kill stream with Mr. Girl. An interesting dichotomy of the founder alt-right versus a gay pedophile. Look at you. Okay. I'm not okay. I'm not sure I would make such a strong accusation about Mr. Girl. It was an interesting conversation. I think people did gain from it, and very interesting. Okay, so do we want to add anything else, or should we call it quits?
I had some other notes. I don't know. I mean, if you're ready to go, though, I can bail on it definitely.
No. By all means, just let us know.
Well, so this is just going back to the film itself. I just thought it was that scene, which I think is kind of a funny and kind of maybe endearing on some level, but there is a scene where Danny LaRusso goes on a date with the the Elizabeth Shue character, Allie, and the mother pulls up in the car that's falling apart in front of the house. And it's just a kind of like funny scene, and the parents are like, you can tell the parents are like horrified on some level, or there's this kind of, that's sort of the elephant in the room. They're like, what kind of person is my daughter getting involved in? And it almost seems like she's being abducted by like a group of gypsies or something on some level. But there is something that like that's also kind of and I think that in some levels Jews are better at this than Gentiles, in the sense that in maybe in the case of um, Daniel, it's not correct because ultimately, Daniel represents, the way that we've decoded, he represents a kind of Jewish competitor or whatever. But he's evidently someone who has these kind of he's intelligent, he has these virtues. Like on some level, he's kind of a good guy, and he's
Yeah.
not necessarily a bad guy for your daughter to be dating. If we just look at it in a kind of just in a non-ethnic level, or just what I'm saying. So like he's not a bad guy, but he does come from a poor setting, right? And so he doesn't come from a setting as wealthy as her. And I think that Jews actually do have a greater mobility than Gentiles in a lot of ways. And it's probably due to their itinerant, uh, that's how you say it, itinerant
Yeah.
nature, or their nomadic nature. Is that sometimes they start at kind of the bottom, on some level in societies, and they have to kind of work their way up to the top. I mean, that is true of Gentiles, of course, as well. But it's just, I think that it does kind of like, I think that we are, as Gentiles, can be guilty of a kind of shallowness, where we aren't always seeing, that we're over impressed, and I mean, obviously, I'm an Apollonian, so I'm in favor of beauty, right? And I'm in
Yeah.
favor of power and success and all of these things. Of course, these are kind of Apollonian virtues, as it were. But I think that sometimes we, and I've noticed this in the DRs, that sometimes people are kind of over impressed with like appearances, whether it's appearances of beauty, and or it's appearances of power. Like for example, Trump would be a very good example of this. Trump, I think people are overexcited, and some people still remain excited about Trump. But it's related to this kind of shallowness of just not like being able to really see who that person is or what he signifies, And I
Yeah.
think that scenes like that in films where, like, the guy's a good guy, and you have sympathy for him because you know that he's a good guy. He's not bad for their daughter. Ultimately, if we take out the sort of the ethnic questions in the film, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
um, I think that there is something there that Jews are able to kind of make that critique of Gentile society, and on some level, there is some validity to that critique. One example I was thinking of in the Annie Hall film, Woody Allen's Annie Hall film. There's a scene, and you could say, "Well, this is kind of insulting to Gentiles," and it is on some level. It's insulting to Gentiles, but he's Woody Allen's character, Albie Singer, is is fretting or having anxiety about his relationship with this Gentile figure, Annie Hall, and he stops this like sort of random couple in the street, and it's like a tall, good-looking blonde guy with a good-looking blonde woman. Evidently, they're supposed to be Gentiles, right? And he says, what is you guys seem so happy. What is your secret to romantic success or whatever? And they say, well, we're both really shallow. So I mean, it's obviously a dunk on Gentiles, but it's also, I think that there is something there in the sense that, like, you observe it in the DR where people are just like get way overexcited about a guy like Trump, or some guy that happens to be getting a lot of views now or whatever.
Yeah.
And they don't realize that it's just not, like, some things are just kind of vapor, that they're not there to last, and that they're kind of,
Yeah. Like Trump hugging the American flag at CPAC or whenever he did that.
yeah,
It's a meaningless gesture. At the end of the day. Or even like, and again, I don't Allie Mills' family, like maybe they're just a little too impressed by driving a Jaguar and living in some ritzy suburban home. At the end of the day, all that stuff, you can lose that stuff. And at the end of the day, you can't take it with you. It's not that important.
yeah. So I thought it was just an interesting scene, you know what I mean? Because I think that there is that kind of mobility among Jews, and which allows them on some level to have that empathy for the various classes, which I think is sometimes lacking among our race. Not in every case, of course,
Yeah.
but there's also a kind of internalness to Jews that I think that Gentile, going back to the Woody Allen scene, I think there's an internalness to Jews that you could, in a way, Jews might imagine themselves as sort of more profound or more spiritual. But it might be related to a kind of innerness in the sense that they're concealing themselves from the Gentile world on some level. Whereas Gentiles are just like, this is, of course you want a beautiful wife. Of course you want wealth and power, or what, like there's a kind of simpler, more deductive view of the world on some level that you could argue is, depending on how we're defining spirituality, is a kind of a less spiritual, more materialistic view of the world. You know what I mean? I mean, Jews obviously have the reputation of being materialistic and capitalistic, but I think you take my point that there is an interiority to Jews that might be absent with Gentiles. And I think I think it's actually kind of, I think I would actually say the same about Mediterraneans as well, is that there's greater interiority with Mediterraneans than there are with Nordic people. Like, if a blonde guy says he's like a liberal, you can believe him, like on some level, right? It's true. Like he doesn't have two faces, right? Or if he says he's a Nazi, he's a Nazi. There's no two. It's a kind of more of a what you see is what you get sort of thing, right?
Yes.
Anyways.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important lesson. All right. Anything else, or should we put a bookmark?
That's the only thing I had to say.
All right. All right. Thanks everyone for watching and listening. And thank you, Mark. And thanks to everyone who threw in a super chat. All right. I'll see you next Sunday.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.